Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at West Virginia Wesleyan College, specializing in American social history and women's history. Please welcome Katharine Antolini.
Thank you. All right, so I was first asked to give this talk a year ago, last Women's History Month in Charleston. So when I sent the title, and they wonder why I had to have it so long. All right, so the simple title is just West Virginia and the Ratification of the 19th Amendment. Simple enough. But as historians, we love grandiose titles. So the full title is, For Those Poor West Virginia Women Working Persistently for Suffrage, Forgive Them, for They Know Not What They Do. And I had to put that's an actual quote from a speech given by Joseph Thurman during the ratification debate in Charleston, and he stood in front on the House chambers in front of his colleagues, and he's urging them, right, to be men, be courageous, and vote against the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because we're doing it to preserve the sanctity of American womanhood. So his argument is for their best interest, that women do not gain the right to vote. He was so adamant about his view that he hoped this is what he's remembered for. That this is from his speech on the House floor. That I want people to come by my grave and point at and go, there lies the man who had the courage and the strength of character to vote against women's suffrage. So he was pretty convinced that he was on the right side of history, all right? That women, from the remark, that women didn't need this vote.
Was he married?
Who would even have them?
All right, so how controversial? Now we look. You go back now and you ask the average American. I ask my students, right? And I have these young girls who are all now voting age, and I say, "What amendment gave them the right to vote?" Right? And the average American doesn't really know. Right? With amendments, they don't make it into the top 10. We tend not to know them, right? So, what was so controversial about such an amendment? Well, now that the average American can't even tell you, or the date when all women gained the right to vote. So, what was so controversial? And I have to explain to my students the fight for this. All right, so Carrie Chapman Catt, during the time of ratification of the 19th Amendment, she is president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It's easier just to say Nassau. So she is president of Nassau at the time. And then in 1923, she writes a history of the struggle, and she's looking back, and she's counting, right? She started in 1868, so right after the war's over, and she's counting the fight, right? All the referendums and the campaigns in order to get to 1920, right? And so I'm trying to instill in these young women in my women's history courses the struggle of this. And of course, remember also those women of the National Women's Party who picketed the White House, the more militant side of the suffrage movement in the early 20th century. These are women who picketed the White House for 18 months. They're called silent sentinels. They stood there day after day after day until eventually they would start to get arrested. 200 women will be arrested. 97 of them will actually spend time in prison. Some of them, while in prison, because they consider themselves political prisoners, will go on a hunger strike and are forced fed. All right, so this is that part of the history of women who, went to jail for the right to vote. Women who, literally put their bodies on the line so women could vote. And so this is where I shame my young students who ask them how many who have voted if they turn 18. Yeah. So looking into why was it so controversial, right? Delegate Thurman referred to it as an epic calamity if we give women the right to vote. So the question is why? And so some of the national fears of why women shouldn't have the right to vote are the same arguments we're going to hear in West Virginia. Between the two big debates of the vote, the first one in 1916 and then the next one in 1920. So we're going to hit exactly what was the big deal of giving women the right to vote. But first, kind of back up and see a little bit of history of suffrage within the state. All right, so the first time the idea, the proposal, hey, why don't we let women in West Virginia vote, was actually pretty early in our state history, 1868. So Samuel Young from Pocahontas County proposed, why don't we let women have the right to vote? And in his suffrage history, she described it as, he found no advocates except himself. I just thought it was a funny way to write that in history. But nobody agreed with him. And there was some challenges that maybe he was doing it less out of because women need rights, but more out of, if we let more women vote, then they will help us make sure that we'll make sure they're Republican. And they can help us counteract ex-Confederates that are coming back to the state. At least, regardless of his motives, all right, he at least attempted. The real start of the suffrage movement in the state begins in 1895 with the first official convention in Grafton, where we organized the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association. So there's initially 9 chapters, right? So cities within the state are really we're on board with this. We want to be part of this movement, but it's just slow going, ebbs and flows. Right, isn't that right enough? Focus. Is that better? Yeah. Because by 1900, it's only back down to 2. So it's a slow start. So Carrie Catt, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who's also a leader of Nassau, are in the state frequently. They're coming into the state in the 1890s, trying to help organize the state. And they're just like, maybe it's just too new of a question, right? Maybe it's just too new of a question in the state that West Virginia women are just not ready yet to organize, with the exception of Northern West Virginia. All right, so if we're looking at the early leaders, the early women leaders of the movement, we're actually looking at Fairmont and Wheeling. So, yay, Wheeling, I think she played a large role. Historian Anne Eflin, I think she is the first historian outside of the women's rights movement itself. She's the first historian who actually took a look at West Virginia suffrage. And this is 1980s. She was a graduate student at WVU. So I think that's the first time a historian ever delved into what was this movement like in the state. And in her study, she was very impressed with Wheeling, early leaders who were turned to being president in the Wheeling area. So Boyd lead, of course, Dr. Harriet Jones. These are women who were going to state fairs and passing out literature, petition campaigns. Women have always had the legal right to petition throughout history. Couldn't vote and couldn't hold office and but we always had the right to petition. That was our one kind of means to have some kind of political influence. So clearly always using the petition campaign. Able to persuade public libraries to subscribe to feminist or suffrage journals. Apparently the papers in Wheeling were much more friendly to the idea of suffrage than other papers because they were more apt to print some of the literature that Nassau would send, and they would print. So it was a more welcoming environment. They also kind of shocked Wheeling when there was the early debates about the charter, redoing the Wheeling charter, and why don't we, as we're thinking the charter, why don't we put in there, let women have the right to vote in Wheeling? And one woman's paper described it. They were a delegation that threw the bombshell into the midst of the astonished commission. So these are women who were willing to lead the charge, right? To push. If other women are hesitant throughout the state, these Wheeling women were certainly leading the way. Okay, so if we're looking in the years between 1900 and 1912, slow but persistent movement. We're slowly kind of moving. By 1905, we have 6 clubs of the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association trying to do activities, having state conventions, and cities would take turns hosting them every year. Again, petitioning because of what we could do, trying to lobby politicians to put bills through the legislature, all these things that women had to do, but it was slow moving. And I like this quote from Anna Southern: "We are rich in sentiment but poor in funds." Right? Those who have the means are handicapped in some way, and those of us who have the zeal have neither time nor money at our disposal, which I think sums up every women's group ever. All right? Those of you who sit on any kind of boards of any kind of group, you understand how hard it can be women to organize. I gave this talk a couple months ago in Morgantown for the League of Women's Voters, and they're like, oh yeah. But again, leading the way is one of your own, right? Dr. Jones. She, again, when the vote came up in 1904 to allow women in Wheeling the right to vote, it failed, but she was part of that charge, hoping to make a difference. She eventually became president herself of the Equal Suffrage Association in 1906. She will speak along with Dr. Shaw from Nassau, trying to get, because in our Constitution it says male citizens of the state shall be entitled to vote. Now, you just remove male will be okay, right? Just say citizens of West Virginia. So they argued in front of the state body, failed. So it was interesting, there was an article about her in 1937. They were kind of celebrating her 80th birthday. And it described her as West Virginia's Susan B. Anthony, which I think is very fitting. All right, a little bit more momentum. All right, so we have 8 clubs by 1912. 1913, we have Delegate Ellis Yost, who proposes to give women the right to vote in West Virginia. It passes the House, fails the Senate. And what's neat about this is Yost's wife, Lena Lowe Yost, is an active suffragist, and she'll go on to be president eventually of the Equal Suffrage Association. So they're a little bit of a power couple in their day of supporting each other's interests. By 1914, the West Virginia Democratic Party is endorsing giving the right to vote. Governor at the time was endorsing. So momentum is building in the state. It's also corresponding with momentum nationwide. All right, so we're not completely unconnected to what's going on nationwide. So Theodore Roosevelt Bull Moose Party is the first national party to officially add suffrage, women's suffrage to their plank. So that's big news. We also have by up to 1914, 11 states that are giving women, these are states that allow full suffrage. There's some states who allow what we call partial suffrage, where women are allowed to vote on tax matters or are allowed to vote on Board of Education elections. But these are the states up to 1914. They gave women full suffrage, the same as men in their states. So there is some slow momentum. This also corresponds with the time of the first huge suffrage parade in D.C. So this is organized by Nassau, particularly organized by Alice Paul in her earliest years with the movement. It was a huge event. They purposely organized it the day before Woodrow Wilson was to be inaugurated, so they knew that there'd be a crowd there. The crowd set in for Wilson, and then there's a parade where there was 5,000 women who participated. It did get kind of violent. There were women that were hurt because some of the observers were not supportive of the suffrage cause, and the police did not do a lot with managing the crowd, so there actually were some women who were hurt during this event. But the idea that suffrage is making the national news, right, in this early period. So when the momentum is building in West Virginia, the momentum is also building nationwide. So we finally come to our first real fight, and that is in 1915, the state legislature passes, agrees for a referendum. All right, we just put it to the people. Let the people decide, what men, let them decide whether or not women should have the right to vote. Because women at this time are frustrated because, if you can't read that, women who can't vote in West Virginia, idiots, lunatics, felons, and women. So, a little tired of being categorized in that group as those within the state of West Virginia who cannot vote. So, it passes the House and it passes the Senate. Okay, let's put it to the vote in November 1916. We'll let West Virginians decide. And it's kind of them passing the buck, if you will, right? You don't want to be the one that votes against something that your constituents wanted or votes for something your constituents didn't want. So it was just easier to let the voters decide because it got kind of nasty. Senator Steed was the only state senator who voted against the referendum. Right? He says, we shouldn't even have a state vote on it. And he was pissed at it. There were women at the chamber. And I don't know what he said, but the way it was accounted, he said something really offensive at the women hissed him. So I don't know what he said, but they kind of boozed him. And then he was later described as a woman hater in the newspaper. So it's getting heated over, so the stakes are kind of high. The idea, we'll just let the voters of Virginia decide whether or not women can vote. All right, so here's the big campaign. Nassau pumped $17,000 into the campaign, right? They want to make sure that the male voters of West Virginia, right, who are not lunatics and felons, right, will vote the right way to give women the right to vote. They send in organized speakers, referred to as the flying squadron, who go around the state giving stump speeches, right, trying to encourage men to vote for the referendum. One of the fascinating things that they do also, they set up what are known as suffrage schools, and this time they had one set up in Charleston. And what it does, it educates women. You have women who never really might have thought of themselves as political creatures to begin with, and wouldn't know how to lead a movement, or wouldn't know how to lobby a politician, wouldn't know. So they taught them. These women not only need the confidence that they can do this, but they need a little shove, a little direction. This is how you organize. This is what you say to your delegate. This is what you need to tell the men around you to vote. So educating women in order to help lead a movement in the state. The West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association, we pumped in about 90,000. In comparison, we had hoped to contribute more, but we were unable to. Again, Dr. Harriet Jones is given a significant amount of credit for this, because she's the one helping the flying squadron make it around the state. So she was primarily in charge of organizing all that, of making sure they're getting where they need to go and they're being heard. So again, another one of your really leading the way for women. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, right? So between 1916 and 1919, there are 8 states who vote on in their state whether or not to give them the right to vote in their state. We are the one of the 3 that doesn't pass, and we're the one that fails the biggest. It's 3-1, right? 73% of those who voted said no to really give them the right to vote. And it's a shock. It really is. It's a shock to Nassau. It's a shock to the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association. They really didn't. They thought they were good. They were kind of fairly confident, but then it doesn't, right? Because they were confident because they thought the kind of things that were tripping up the movement in other states wouldn't be a problem in West Virginia. For example, there is a national association opposed to women's suffrage. Yes, there are groups of women who actively are fighting against not being political, or being political to make sure that other women don't become political, right? They're purposely, they don't think women have the right to vote for their various reasons. So there is a national organization opposed to women, but there didn't have any chapter in our state until summer of 1916, right? Whereas Nassau was constantly in their state trying to get us organized. The anti-group never was, because they never thought West Virginia, maybe they never thought it was that big of a threat. But not until the referendum, right? They come flooding in the summer of 1916, and apparently were better organized than the suffrage groups thought they would be. They were also confident in the state that suffrage would pass because of one of the leading, throughout the history of suffrage, particularly when we get to the early 20th century. One of the strongest opponents to suffrage has always been the liquor industry. If you think about the history of Prohibition, right? If we talk way back in the early 19th century with the Temperance movement, when that starts, it's a movement led by women, right? Women who believed that the abuse of alcohol was the gateway sin, right, to all kinds of abuses. So women have always been very active in fighting against to make drinking and sell alcohol illegal. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which historically has been one of the largest women's rights, women's groups in American history, openly advocates and endorses suffrage in 1882. The West Virginia Temperance Union is also founded in 1883, is also a strong advocate of stopping the sale of manufacturing of liquor. within the United States. So you can see why, if I'm in the liquor industry, last thing I want are women who have the right to vote, women who are part of the prohibition movement. They give them the power. It's one thing to persuade men to vote for prohibition, but if you can cast your own ballot, that's a threat. So one of the leading advocates against suffrage has historically been the liquor industry. But the problem is, that shouldn't have bothered our state. We're already dry, right? So by the time of 1916 referendum, we're already a dry state. We've been a dry state officially since 1914. So Ellis Yost, the same man who in 1913, the same year, introduced the suffrage bill, also has his name on the Prohibition Act. So it's his bill, when it passes through, that will turn the state dry officially in 1914. So we figure, well, that shouldn't be an issue then, right? The liquor industry shouldn't care about us because we're already a dry state. So the arguments that are being used nationally to prevent women the right to vote, we figure they shouldn't be that big a deal in the state. So Lena Yost, at this time, again, Ellis Yost's husband, told you they're the power couple, not only is she the president of the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association during this fight, but she's the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So, and that hasn't happened in any other state, right? So this is the first time that you have a woman who's president of two influential groups, both of them all behind giving the right to vote. And she's very confident, right? Those men who fought, who voted for prohibition, right? Certainly they will follow us, and they will again go, yes, we agree that women should have the right to vote. She thought it would be an easy sell, right? They supported her and her interests when they wanted to. Yeah, and she's confident, right? She's given an interview in Clarksburg Telegram, sorry. And she's confident that she's the first Eastern and Southern state to grant suffrage to women. She's convinced West Virginia will be the first one. At the vote, she has women camped out, right? 88 women, they're divided in 4 different shifts. They're there constantly at the polls, right? Lobbying, making sure that men go. That is a card that we found in the Art Historical Society in Upshur County. So we believe that it was passed out during the referendum fight. So I do have copies up here, if you want one. So they were, this is their fight, this was it, and they were so confident that it was going to work. But it doesn't, right? So those counties who voted overwhelmingly for prohibition are the same counties who voted overwhelmingly against suffrage. All right, so the prohibition vote wasn't there, with the exception of Brooke and Hancock County. They are the only 2 counties in the entire state that voted for the referendum. They were the only 2. I put Ohio County up there. Ohio County was one of 3 counties that voted against both prohibition and suffrage. So they did both. But, so it didn't translate. She thought they would. She thought the men who voted for prohibition would be the same men that would support suffrage, and it did not work out that way, except for Brooke and Hancock County. They're devastated, right? Nassau is very bitter. She still blames it on the liquor industry. I mean, that's their nemesis through the whole movement, is that liquor industry. And she's convinced this is payback. That these are those who were mad about the state's strict prohibition law. This was payback. So she still blames it on the liquor industry. That was why, right? No state campaign ever quite so completely routed the drunks and the ne'er-do-wells of all kinds of election day as did West Virginia. So she's bitter about the loss. Lena is upset too, but she doesn't blame it so much on the liquor industry. She blames it on women, right? Just the indifference, right? And of course, those who actively oppose, but I think she's more upset about the indifference. The women just chose to do nothing. I think that upset her more. So let's look at those arguments. Why in the world would women not want the right to vote? Right? All right, so the arguments that the West Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage were the classic ones, the same ones you're going to hear in other states through the whole process. It's a burden, right? That a majority of women don't want a right to vote. Why force something onto a majority of people that only a small minority want? That's not democracy, right? So they're arguing women simply, it's a burden. And it's a duty that you need to take seriously. And as women, our first priority is to our children. And so for us to be effective political actors. You have to be up on politics. And as women, we simply do not have that time. And so it's better just to let men do that, right? So kind of think of the public sphere, the world of politics, as being where men should be, where women are in the private sphere, right? Tending to the needs of our family. Let men do what men do, right? We have our own responsibilities. Let's trust men to speak for us as they care for us as husbands and brothers and sons, right? Let's trust them to do it. And if all else fails, threaten socialism, right? That's the, remember that every socialist and every feminist is a woman suffragist, so it's tried and true argument and politically to scare people, right? Thus, it's un-American to force the views of the fanatical few on the many. So this is not an argument unique to West Virginia. They're repeating the same arguments that you are hearing in every other state, right, dealing with this issue. Men tend to be not so nice in their reason why women should have the right. Simply, we're just not smart enough. Right? Something about our uterus must drain the power from our brains. We're simply not capable. So that's a little harsh. Harry Temple of Pendleton County, insisting that we just don't have the mental capacity to understand the complications of politics. We just simply can't do it. So it's a little harsh, but you don't have women saying that. But you do have the men saying that. Also, the classic argument that men are using is that, it's men and women are meant for different things. Whether it's God ordained that we are in different spheres, but the idea that women's place is in our home, right? We reign within the domestic sphere. That's where we belong. Our energies need to be focused. Let men handle the political arguments. That's again, you hear that argument repeated over and over and over again. By men in every state. So when it comes down to it, then why in the world did we lose that conservative vote, right? So especially Nona Yosef was hoping she'd get the church vote because the church voted for prohibition. So she figured, well, the church vote would go on and see the need to give women the right to vote, right? Because they appreciated the work that women did in order to get prohibition through the state. But there's always a fear of it's okay giving women some power, but then there's too much power, right? And you might trust some women to vote, but when you give women the right to vote, you give all women the right to vote. So can we really trust all women the right to vote? So it came down to it as men fall on the side of being conservative, are kind of uncomfortable with this idea of the specter of the unruly woman, right? What happens if we give women the right to vote and then we can't control what they do? Right? That's kind of threatening. I saw this in the Wheeling paper and I had to put it out. I like this. Just when you're hearing about that you are not capable of voting, it must be humiliating to a man to say by either his voice or his vote that his mother or his wife is not intelligent enough to be entrusted with the Ferentides. None of them would say such a thing on the day his mother died, nor on the day of the glorious memory when he proposed to his sweetheart. So they don't say it to your face. In their men's club, they'll tell you you're not smart enough to vote, but they're not brave enough to tell you your face. Some of them, anyway. All right, so it was a huge loss. It shook them because they really thought it should have been an easy win. And so the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association is kind of demoralized. They will actually have a convention in 1917. All of 20 women show up for it. So they're shook. And plus the war will interrupt it. And people will decide to focus their efforts in World War I. But it's interesting. Again, we don't think of West Virginia as influencing national politics as much, but they really did. Nassau was doing its state-by-state campaign, right? Every state, they were campaigning to get women the right to vote. And she realized, the leaders of Nassau realized, if we can't get one through West Virginia, and that should have been a kind of an easy one, there's no way we're going to get it through the rest of the South. There's just no way. So the defeat in West Virginia in 1960 does influence the national movement, and Nassau decides maybe we should stop focusing on state by state by state by state. Maybe it's time now, let's do the federal amendment, right? And then we can force the states, who wouldn't have done it on their own, to do it. So that's what they start to do. And it pays off, right? So they start debating in Congress about an amendment. And again, men arose to make interminable speeches and terminal speeches on men's God-given right to tell women what she must and must not do. So it must be very galling for the women in the chamber now listening to these men debate, what women cannot do. But it works. The amendment passes the House in January 1918. It goes through the Senate in June 1919. By December 1919, it's ratified by 22 states. It needs 36. And the goal is to get it ratified before November 1920, so you can have women, all women having the right to vote in the first presidential election. So the push is to have it ratified, to have the rest of the states needed to ratify it, to have it done in time for November 1920. West Virginia, however, is not planning to meet. This legislation session wouldn't be until after November 1920. So for us to have a role in voting on the 19th Amendment, we had to call a special session. And early on, Governor John Cornwell was sympathetic towards the cause, right? He really thought that he wanted to ratify the 19th Amendment. He's just worried about the timing of it, right? He's a politician. So having a way, right? Worried about if he called a special session, would there be enough support? He's worried about Republicans using it against the Democrats. He's worried about, he wants West Virginia to have its place in history. So we have all these things in his head. And he's constantly communicating with Lena Yost again. Lena Yost, after 1916, she resigned from the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association. She was a little bit lost. She didn't completely leave the movement, but she moved to DC for a while to work with the Temperance Union. She comes back though. When the state has this role again to play in the ratification, she comes back from DC and agrees to take charge of the ratification committee. So it's her job, right, to get everybody mobilized, to make sure, should a special session be called, that the votes are there. So she's back in the game again after leaving in 1916. So he does call a special session. Luckily, there's another issue that needs to be talked about, some tax issue. So it's not just an issue on suffrage. So the group men have to meet anyway on a tax issue, so why not use this opportunity to also vote on the ratification of the 19th Amendment while we're all together. I think things look good. Things look good. President Woodrow Wilson at this time is supporting the suffrage amendment, so he sends telegrams. Both parties, Republican and Democrat national parties, are sending telegrams, hold the party line, right, let's all do what we need to do. Lena is in full go. She, again, petitions are the key. Written petitions, again, because we can do that. Also, I like the idea of living petitions. Go to them, right? Go to your politician and tell them they can't dodge you when you're right in front of them. They can ignore a petition, right? They can ignore letters sent to them. They can't ignore you if you're right in front of them. So, again, and her need to have women in front of these men's faces, her need, if you can't make it to Charleston, at least send a petition, is her need to counter out that argument that women in West Virginia don't want the vote. Well, how can you say that when there are women in front of your face, when they're sending, petitions from 23 counties? How can you say they don't want it? So the high hopes. Again, we're excited. NASA's excited. The National Women's Party also comes a little bit into the state to help. They're excited. All right, we're papers are certain. This is good. What's also seemed to change thing here is the role of women during World War I. And so there's evidence of that, of women within the state. Women who maybe did not support suffrage before, but after World War I realized, look at what we did. Look at what we did. Right? We were active and we helped our country win this war. A war that was supposed to make the world free for democracy, a world safe for democracy. Certainly, women deserve that said democracy. There's even evidence of men changing their mind, even kneeling, right? And where, you're right, these women proved themselves. When our nation was at war, why wouldn't they deserve the right to vote? So things are a little bit different than it was in 1916, because now we're on the other side of the war, where women played a part. So again, reasons why hopes are high. Well, 100 years ago, today, right, passes the House, deadlocks in the Senate. So they're stuck. So the problem is, now that there's this deadlock in the Senate, it gives time for the opposition to mobilize and mobilize well. And they come flooding in. So we're not just talking about within the state. Women, there are in West Virginia anti-suffragists, but flooding in from other parts of neighboring states to come in and help. And there was worry that, the support is going to drop away like cherries from a tree. Right? So they were worried as this gets stalled that, oh my gosh, it's not going to go happen. Same arguments as used before, right? Petitions sent to kind of convince men to vote against it, Majority of women in West Virginia don't want it, right? Despite those who come and knock on the door, majority of us don't want it. That we're trying to preserve American womanhood. So they're very much along the line of Thurman when he's demanding his men to be courageous and be strong. That we need to protect American womanhood. Also, national literature coming in saying against suffrage, socialism, and sabotage. Again, after World War I, it's even more kind of a potent scare. So it's a strategy that works. The only new argument that folds into here is the states' rights one. Or how dare they force amendment onto us? It should be our states determine whether or not women vote in our state. When it was a referendum, obviously states' rights didn't, it wasn't an issue. So that's the only new argument that floods in during the ratification process. How dare the federal government force upon us? Tell us what to do. And again, it's always that specter of the unruly woman. Right, so Thurman in his same speech, he doesn't like these women who are like roaring lions, threatening high officials, intimidating congressmen, infesting legislative halls. He says, these are the women you want to give the right to vote. Right, these unfeminine, man-like women. These are, so they get scared. You can't, because that's it. When you give all women the right to vote, you give all women the right to vote, even the ones you can't control. So there's that threat, right? But when, even though it passes the House and deadlocks in the Senate, there was hopes that it would be over. So I love this. It's back to the curling irons and the rolling pins for women. Nice. So initially, Thurman would look hopeful. I thought it was going to deadlock in the Senate and it will die. So we won't be a part of the process. Still, hope, right? Wilson sending, the president sends you a telegram and says, listen, pull the party line. And they're like, no, trying to get, because it's 14-14 in the Senate, trying to get some, at least the Democrats, to change their vote. They're like, no, we won't do it. So we have this standoff. The only way to break it is to get Jesse Block here, who is vacationing in California. It's a special session, all right? So he had plans, all right? And it was about a tax issue. So he didn't, but then, so here it is. There's this big, and I was at an event in Charleston a couple of weeks ago, and somebody claims there's family lore that Block heard about it when he was swimming in his swimming trunks, and he raced to get in his swimming trunks. I don't know. But another story that he was out golfing when he heard that he had to come back. All right, so here's this 3,000-mile race to get back. All right, so he's from California to Chicago to Cincinnati and then to Charleston. And there's the National Republican Party behind him, and they're organizing. He has this choice, by the time he gets to Chicago, he has this choice to get on a plane and get to Cincinnati or by train. And his wife doesn't want to fly, so they go by train. But there was the idea that he's going to fly, and they're like, okay, this is 1920. So she's like, I'm not getting on a plane. So this mad race back. So in the meantime, we have the anti-suffragists then. Well, we only have days, right? It's all going to be over when he shows up. So they're trying to do everything they can to stop it. One, scare him. Again, you give them the right to vote. When they have to think about alcohol, they might have to think about tobacco as well. And if that's how you're making your money, right? Because the Brothers Tobacco Company, these women might, so threatening and scaring him. You do this, you realize these women could come after you next. Trying to end the session. Oh, you're wasting tax. We're waiting for this man to come. You're wasting taxpayers' money. Man, let's close it. There was even a fear that they might kidnap him. Right? That things would get so bad that they would kidnap the man, so he can't come to vote. So nail biter, right? Everybody's waiting, and I like this again reported in the Wheeling paper. You know, where's Locke? Everybody's worried, everybody's waiting. Where he's coming in that political cartoon, right? Come save my baby, the vote, and he's racing in from California to save. When he was in Cincinnati, and he was waiting to board the train to get to Charleston, he apparently took the time to talk to a reporter while he was there. And then this also makes it into the Wheeling paper. He said, you know, he admits I wasn't a suffragist. His wife is. He did admit that his wife is. But he's like, well, I'm not. But, you know, if women want to vote, darn it, why not let them? Very cavalier. And he thought it was Tommy rot. This is all Tommy rot about the idea that voting will take women away from the home when you only vote only one day. Certainly more. So, okay. So the opposition, one last desperate attempt to stop this. All right, so a man named Archibald Montgomery had resigned in June 1919 from Logan County because he moved out of state. So he tried to get reseated. And they're like, well, you left. He's like, no, I want to come back now, and I want to take my seat back. And he wanted to be the vote that would counteract Locke's vote, so it would be a tie again. But they tried to reseat the senator that had been living out of state. It didn't work, because the governor pulls out, well, I have your resignation letter right here. So it didn't work. But the last kind of desperate attempt. Meanwhile, Len is like, she just has to hold on, right? She has to make sure that those who are in support of suffrage stay in support of suffrage and stay there, right? Because you can't have men leave and then they call a vote to end the session and then aren't there. And then once, the senator gets there, that everybody's there to cast the vote. So she has assigned all of her members of the committee, you keep an eye on these men, you keep track of where they are. And so there's one story of one woman one of her legislators was a carpenter who kind of left to do work, and she had to go find him. They had to climb up the scaffolding. And said, you need to get down, and you need to get back to the gavel, because there's going to be a vote coming. So the idea, they had to, this is it. We can't let men leave, and can't let a vote be called for the session to end. Finally, he shows. Yay! And he votes to break the tie, but then Senator Burr changes his vote. I didn't feel like he could have done that before, but now he realizes he's going to be on the wrong side of history. He changes his vote. So it does officially pass in the Senate 16-14. So we become the 34th state, kind of a nail biter, to ratify the 19th Amendment. What's fascinating, and I didn't know that much when I was first asked a year ago. I knew the centennial was coming. I do teach a course on the women's rights movement in American history from both early and modern feminism. And I kind of knew the story of the movement, but I never really studied within the state. And usually when we talk about the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Tennessee always gets all the attention. One, because it was the last state. It was the 36th state that was needed, and it did only pass by one vote. A senator, he was the youngest man. He was going to originally vote against the ratification, but he got a telegram from his mother. So that is a true story. She changes his vote, and so Tennessee becomes the 36th state because a mother convinced his son to do the right thing. So that's a good story. But West Virginia, that's an equally good story, right? The man had to come flying back from California, and there was fears that he might get out. It was just all this drama, right? So West Virginia is an equally good story. And again, if you look at Carrie Catt in Nassau, and they're looking back at the history, she even said, even though we needed 2 more states after West Virginia, she said, once West Virginia went, I knew. She's like, I knew. It was just a matter of time, right? So how important our state was in the history of this, and also encouraging for the movement that when we went through, they knew it was just a matter of time before it would go through. So we did play our part in this story. So the last thing I have on here, The Woman Citizen is a suffrage magazine, and somebody wrote a whole poem to Jesse in honor, calling him the suffragist Paul Revere. From his comments. I know it's kind of, maybe you can go later and try to read it, or I can fix it so you can read it off my laptop, but a whole poem about how, what a brave man to come to rescue the women of the state. Okay, so that's all I have. And that's and I enjoyed, like I said, I didn't know that much about the state's history and involved with it. I'm glad I found out because it really is a good story and that needs to be told and remembered. Questions then? Yeah.
In the early slide, 1914, all the states that had ratified by then were western states.
Yeah.
Why?
Couple reasons. One, it was easier out west, particularly the territories were easier. So Wyoming, for example, is the first, yeah, it's way back. Wyoming becomes the first territory and then the first state to give women the right to vote. And there's several reasons why. One, if it's a territory, it's easier to get the right to vote because all you need is the legislator say, yes, women can vote, and the governor approve of it. So it's very easy in a territory government. For the states out west to do it, there were several reasons why. And one theory was, that one right there, right? One theory was to build up the West, right? You want this population to grow. If you want to encourage the population to go, what might attract people to come out west? If you give women the right to vote, that attract, especially for territories. Territories need to have a certain amount of population or become state. So some thought, so Utah and Wyoming, who were early territories, thought maybe if they allowed women to have the right to vote, it would encourage population. Another theory is that if we think about the population of the West, in the late 19th century particularly, it's a lot of transient. We're talking about the gold miners, ranchers. So the fear is, if you want your state to grow, you want to give farmers votes. You want these homesteaders. You want the homesteaders who are there, who are committed. You don't want these transient railroad workers or another group. You don't want these transient men that are coming out of your state to have too much power, because they tend to vote the way that their bosses tell them to vote, right? These cowboy railroads, gold miners. So the idea, if we give women the right to vote, then you're doubling the farmers' vote. So because these transient men are married, these ranchers are not, they're single men who come and go. But if we give women the right to vote in these states, then you're not only giving the farmers' vote, you're getting the farmers' wives' vote. Also racism, Chinese are an issue out west. Even though by the 1830s we're preventing Chinese from gaining any kind of citizenship if they're in the country, it's still the pigtail vote, it was called. It was still the idea, let's use if we give women the right to vote, will help to counteract. Mormons are actually a big supporter of giving women the right to vote. Two, a lot of it maybe because it's simply strengthening the Mormon church in Utah, so they were advocates of giving women the right to vote. So there's a lot of different kind of reasons.
Not so much a suppression then in the West.
No, it was more of, that there was more of a political advantage to let women the right to vote as compared to in the East. Right? And they also, out West was more third-party politics, the progressive movement, not the populist movement, the populist movement in the late 19th century. You're fighting against the Democrats and you're fighting against the Republicans, and you have the Populist Party who say, hey, we want women to have the right to vote. It was early, so there was kind of hopes too of if third-party politics. And so the West is a unique case. It was just so much easier out there for a lot of those different kind of dynamics. Yeah.
I'm a member of the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs, and I'm legislative chair for the Women's Club of the Evening. Right now, the ERA is back on the agenda, and it was started in 1928 by the suffrage movement, by the way. And right now there is a resolution, it's called Resolution 6. Are you aware of that in the Senate?
I know it's gone back through.
Right.
Because the argument that it should have expired, the date for ratification should have expired.
Right. What the argument is is the Senate extended the ratification process back in the 1970s. You know, you have 3 years to have the states ratify. What has happened is, since they've already extended the ratification date twice, why can't we make it indefinite? And Virginia, in January, voted as the 38th state for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. What is happening in West Virginia, this legislative session, equal rights, equal pay bill made it through the House, but was defeated in the Senate. So, again, it's the argument that the federal government, if they extend the ratification, then that will force states to have equal pay for women.
And that's heaven forbid.
And of course, there are certain factions in the legislature that voted against.
So way in the back, right?
Do you have any idea what the response was at the election?
Oh,
Did a lot of women come out?
Oh, 1920? I'm in the process of trying to figure out, I think it'd be interesting to try to find out who was the first woman to vote in every county. And I guess, but that's a matter of going through poll records, and a lot of counties will not have them anymore. So we're currently trying to find them in Upshur County. And we want to know who was the first one to cast a vote. So it was anticlimactic. You would think, oh yes, we want to get the right to vote, and this revolution that they thought would happen didn't happen. Not a lot of women came out. Probably a third. State, I don't know about the state, but at least nationwide came out to vote, and they voted for Warren Harding, which turned out to be one of the worst presidents in America. It wasn't a very noble start. There is in Cobble County, Irene, I'm going to say Bohr, B-U-H-R. So we do know she was the first woman in Huntington to vote. But I'm sure if you're interested and you can find polling records from 1920 just to see what women are on the roster, it'd be interesting to find out in each county who were the women who took it upon themselves to do it. So I don't know.
I'm not a flaming women's libber, but I can see in this women were considered second-class citizens.
Oh, sure.
And I want men in this room to realize, I just read a book called The Invisible Woman. Women in the world there are more numerous in numbers than men. And I want you to think about this, and I'm aware of it as I get older. When we talk about safety of seat belts, the person they use as the model is a smaller man. And women aren't small men. I mean, our feet are different, we're different. And as I get older and you take medicine, they don't really have in their focus group, their trial group, are men. They're not, particularly not older women. And I'm not saying women grab flags and start marching. I'm just saying the world needs to realize when China could only have one child, they killed the girl babies. They wanted the boys. Now they're having a heck of a note finding wives for all these spoiled 30-year-old men. So I see that, I think I want to just make this statement, that women are still, in a way, considered second-class citizens. And we are the majority in the world, ladies.
Just like the lady said in the back about the ERA, we're still fighting for that. It's been decades. Though up to the point where the 19th Amendment passed, had that been the longest fight for an amendment?
I don't know. Could be. For suffrage, yeah. I mean,
Yes,
African American men. Yeah.
Because I would have gone back decades also, back from the mid-1800s up to...
Yeah, if you're talking about Seneca Falls, which is 1848, Seneca Falls is the first women's rights convention in American history, and in their Declaration of Sentiments, which is modeled after Declaration of Independence. So clever. And when I teach that course, I have my students, we read the Declaration of Independence, which is sad how many of them have never read it. And the Declaration of Independence is short. It's a very short, brilliant document, they don't read it. So I make them read it. So they read the Declaration of Independence, and then they read the Declaration of Sentiments that was passed in 1848 at Seneca Falls, and they compare it. So it's not all men are created equal, all men and women are created equal. So they change it. But they talk, and all the grievances, but their leading grievance was that women are denied the franchise. And that has always been their biggest fight. And also always been the most controversial. There were people who attended Seneca Falls Convention who would not sign that document because they wanted the right to vote. In 1848, that is, I tell you the best way I do it. When I give this talk to my students, this is the best way I explain it to them. All right, I have a 12-year-old son. I think my 12-year-old should have the right to vote. He's born in this country. It's his future we're screwing up, right? He should have a say on, he should have a say in the political life. It's his future. And I want to pass an amendment where everybody over the age of 12 have the right to vote. And so I asked my students, how well do you think that would go over? Right? If I'm trying to get petitions on, I think I want an amendment for my 12-year-old to vote, what would people say to me? And they'll say, oh, well, he's too young. What does he know about politics? Right? He wouldn't know anything about it. He's not smart enough, he's not savvy enough. That's why you have parents. You need to vote for his best interest. I'm like, that's exactly what they were telling women. That we were like children. In the evolution, there's children, women, men. And so that's what we were being told. What do women know about politics? We're not smart enough. We're not in tune with that. That's why we have husbands who will vote for our best interest. Right? So that seems they seem to go, oh. So second-class status, certainly. Being treated like children, absolutely. All right? In the evolution, we were a step up above children, but not that far. In some cases, in the view that we couldn't carry that responsibility. Okay. It doesn't matter, whatever, you can find it, I will.
Since you work with young people as a teacher, maybe you'll agree with me on this, maybe you won't, but I think our generation has not really carried the ball, and the struggle definitely persists, but I have a 13-year-old granddaughter who sees things completely differently. And when I look at things through her eyes, she has no doubt that someday she'll either play in the NBA or she's going to be president. I mean, there's...
Realizing that long ago you couldn't even play in school.
Right.
Yeah.
And she does everything. Everything. And I hope she's not the first woman president, but someone comes before that. Until that happens, but I think the next generation is on the right track. I really do.
I think
I encourage her.
that is better education. I don't know. I tell you, when I was in college, and granted I was in college in the early 90s, I never had a women's history course. I think when I came back to teach at Wesleyan in 2004, I offered the first women's history course ever. And so, but now we have African American history, now we have gender studies. So I think what's happening too now is that we have a generation of women who are benefiting from the history. We're also thinking about those who went to college. I'm thinking about the modern feminist movement, those women who picked up the fight in the 1960s. They were going to college and never took a women's, never knew anything about women's history, never told about women in literature, never told them how they started the fight to reclaim her story. Right? And so I think we have, thankfully, right, a generation of women now who are getting the education. They're being told they can do whatever they want to do, when beforehand they weren't told that. Yeah, that you were blind as a mother. Now we're like, everyone. So hopefully, you're right. Hopefully they will not be as complacent. Because they would just vote. That's the next thing, is getting them out to vote.
Yodeling Dick here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with Books. lunch with booze at the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yoga. Hey, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch!